Hello there, my name is Christopher Smith, and I'm going to be doing John Stuart Mill on Liberty with a William Shatner impersonation. The subject of this essay is not so-called liberty of the will, so unfortunately opposed to the misnamed doctrine of philosophical necessity, but civil or social liberty. The nature and limits of the power which can be legitimately exercised by society over the individual. A question, seldom stated, and hardly ever discussed, in general terms, which profoundly influences the practice controversies of the age and latent presence, and is likely soon to make itself recognized as the vital question of the future. It is also far from being new that, in a certain sense, it has discovered that mankind, almost from the remote ages, but in the stages of progress in which the more civilized proficient and species have now entered, it presents itself under new conditions and requires a different, more fundamental treatment. The struggle between liberty and authority is the most conspicuous feature, and the proportions of history with which it earlier familiar practically in that of Greece, Rome, and England. But in old times, the consent were between subjects, or some cases, subjects of the government, while liberty was meant to be protection against the tyranny of the political rulers. And the rulers were convinced, except in popular governance of Greece, as a necessarily antagonist position to the people whom they ruled. They consisted of a governing one or governing tribe, or caste, who devised the authority from inheritance or conquest to all events, did not hold in pleasure of the government governed, and whose supremacy men did not venture, perhaps did not despair to its contents, whether precautions might be taken against its oppressive exercise. The power was regarded as necessary, but also as highly dangerous, as a weapon which they could attempt to use against their subjects, no less against external enemies. To prevent the weaker members of the community from being betrayed on by immoral vultures, it was needful that there should be an animal of prey stronger than the rest, commissioned to keep them down. But the king of vultures would be no less upon prey upon the flock than any might have harpies. It was indispensable to be a perpetual attitude defiance on the break and clause. The aim, therefore, of patriots was that limits to the powers of the rulers should be suffraged to the exercise over the community, and this limitation was that meant by liberty. It was attempted in two ways. First, by obtaining recognition of certain immunities, called political liberties, or rights, which it was to regard as a breach of duty in the ruler infringe, and which, if he did infringe, specified resistance or general rebellion, was held justifiable. His second, January and later expedition, joking, of body of some sort, and supposed to represent its interest, was making a necessary condition to some of the more important of the governing powers to refer to these modes of limitations, the ruling power, and most European countries compelled, more or less, to submit. It was not so with the second, and to attain this, or this already some possessed to attain it more compelled by every word to repairs of the lovers of liberty. And so long as mankind were content to combat an enemy by another, and to be ruled by a master on conditions of being guaranteed more or less efficiently against tyranny, did not carry their aspirations beyond this point. Over time, the progress of human affairs, man receives to think it's necessary of nature that the governors should be an independent power, oppose its interests to themselves. It appeared to be much better than the various magistrates of the state should be lieutenants or delegates, recoverable of their pleasures. In that way alone, it seems, could they have complete security, but the powers of government would never be abused, like me. They could have confidence in their powers of government, they should never be abused to their disadvantage. By degrees of this new demand, for elected and temporary rulers become the prominent object of their extensions of the popular party. Whenever any such party existed, and suppressed to be a considerable extent the previous efforts to limit the power of the ruler, the ruled. Some persons began to think that too much importance had been attached to the limitations of the power itself. That, it might seem, was a resource against the rule's interests were habitually opposed to the people. What was now wanted was that the ruler was identified with the people, that their interests and will should be interested in the nation. The nation did not need to be protected against its own will. There was no fear in tyrannizing over itself. Let the rulers be efficiently responsible to it promptly, removed by it, and could afford to trust that the power, its own power, concentrated in the form of convenient for exercise, the mode of thought, or rather, perhaps, of feeling, was common amongst the last generation of European liberalism. In the continental section, which apparently predominates those who admit any limit, what a government may do except the case of such governments, and as they think ought to exist by content, a similar tone, sentiment might be by the time by their own country, and the circumstances for which they encouraged it had continued unaltered. That's all I'm going to say. Goodbye.